So hello and welcome to this NPTEL course entitled Introduction to Cultural Studies, where we're looking at Ian Hacking's book, The Social Construction of What. We have already had some lectures in this book, and we'll hopefully wind up this particular text in another couple of lectures. So we were saying how Hacking has problems with the idea of social construction being an overdetermining principle of analysis. So he has problems in terms of looking at social constructionist theory as a sole hegemonic theory in terms of looking at cultural categories and subcategories such as race, feminism, gender, etc. And he is more in favor of the word matrix or matrices, as you'll find in this particular section that we'll cover in this lecture. So matrices to Hacking, they are constitutive of more material conditions. So it's not just social, it's material conditions as well. So the materiality of this entire matrix is something that Hacking finds more useful in terms of the situatedness of the subject in that particular matrix. So it's more favor of the matrix, the matrices system, in terms of looking at the human subject, in terms of looking at gender, in terms of looking at nation, race, and all these different and myriad cultural categories that he investigates in this particular book. Okay, so this should be on the screen, the section that we are about to cover. And it's a subsection which is entitled Ideas in the Matrices. So idea is shorthand, and a very unsatisfactory shorthand it is too. The trouble is that we wanted to get some general way to make this distinction needed, not just for X equals women refugees, but for a host of other items said to be socially constructed. Idea may have to serve, although more specific words like concept and kind are waiting in the wings. I do not mean anything curiously mental by idea. Ideas, as we ordinarily use the word, are usually out there in public. They can be proposed, criticized, entertained, and rejected. So it's talking about the category of the idea and how ideas exist in a certain social matrix. Ideas in travel and negotiate with certain material conditions. And again, this brings us back to one of our primary hypotheses in this course, that is this constant loop between interiority and exteriority, between the inside and the outside, between what you're thinking inside your brain and what's happening out there in the world. The externality, the materiality of the external world is constantly feeding off and informing the interiority of the psychological self. And we saw several examples of that, especially and most dramatically in Frantz Fanon's Black Skin, White Masks, as well as in George Orwell's Shooting an Elephant. Okay, and then Hacking goes on to say, ideas do not exist in a vacuum. They inhabit a social setting. Let us call that the matrix within which an idea, a concept, a kind is formed. Matrix is no more perfect for my purpose than a word idea. It derives from a word for womb, but it has acquired a lot of other senses in advanced algebra, for example. The matrix in which the idea of the woman refugee is formed is a complex of institutions, advocates, newspaper articles, lawyers, court decisions, immigration proceedings. So in this section, Hacking is looking at the concept or the category of women refugees, and he's investigating how this concept can be examined using a variety of discourses, not just social constructionist discourses, but also looking at it from a perspective of a matrix which combines different material institutions such as the law firms, immigration codes, paperwork, immigration papers, etc., advocates, etc. So all that the material apparatus is invested into this idea of the matrix in which the concept of the woman refugee is situated, and through which it could be understood in a more complex, holistic manner. Okay, so not to mention the material infrastructure, barriers, passports, uniforms, counters at airports, detention centers, courthouses, holiday camps for refugee children. So he's giving a long list of things, a list of institutions, places, real institutions, real places, real human beings, real documents, which are invested into the entire idea of the woman refugee. You may want to call these social because their meanings are what matter to us, but they are material, and in their sheer materiality make substantial differences to people. So this is a very crucial section where Hacking seems to be making a difference between the social and the material, and he's saying that if you use the word social, it oftentimes becomes a very loose umbrella term, which sort of means something very nebulous, but I think Hacking says that we could do worse. than looking at the materiality of this entire apparatus. We're talking about specific materiality in terms of the material existence of courts, the material existence of passport centers, immigration centers, paperwork, lawyers, etc. So the materiality is something that hacking is drawing our attention to in this particular section. Conversely, ideas about women refugees make a difference to the material environment. Women refugees are not violent, so there's no need for guns, but there's a great deal of need for paper. Material influences the people, many of whom have no comprehension of that paper, I mean the extraordinary paperwork that is invested into the refugee problem, the different offices, the uniforms, sheer matter, even the color of the paint on the walls can gradually replace optimistic hope by a feeling of impersonal and grinding oppression. This discussion of ideas and classification takes for granted the obvious, namely that they work only in a matrix. But I do want to emphasize what in shorthand I call the idea of the woman refugee, that classification, that kind of person. When you read of the social construction of X, it is very commonly the idea of X in its matrix that is meant. So what hacking says over here is that in social construction, which doesn't really, is a very nebulous term, we would be better off in looking at the entire matrix, the material matrix, in which the particular subject, the particular category is situated. And that category could be women refugees, that category could be gender, that category could be foreign policy, etc. Right? So the matrix is a material apparatus, this combination of material, discursive, ideological apparatus, in which every subject is situated, every category, every cultural category is situated. Okay? And ideas, thus understood, do matter. It can really matter to someone to be classified as a woman refugee if she's not thus classified. She may be deported or go into hiding or marry to gain citizenship. The matrix can affect an individual woman. She needs to become a woman refugee in order to stay in Canada. She learns what characteristics to establish, knows how to live a life. By living that life, she evolves, becomes a certain kind of person, a woman refugee. And so it makes sense to say that the very individuals and the experiences are constructed within the matrix surroundings classification woman refugees. So he's talking about the individuality and the experientiality of certain human beings and how the individuality and experientiality can only operate within a particular matrix. So this matrix quality is something that hacking constantly draws our attention to. And one may make a comparison with this and what Lyotard had called language games, in the sense that every one of us, and according to Lyotard, in a postmodern condition, every one of us is situated in certain language games, and all we do is we negotiate and navigate across language games through different nodal points. So nodal points become very important. Nodal points are the points of interaction through which we interact with other subject positions and other language games, and how we interact across language games, across subject positions. So hacking over here seems to offer a similar structure in terms of the matrix. So the matrix becomes the material entanglement in which the human subject is situated, and from where the human subject navigates and negotiates through that entanglement in terms of acquiring in subjectivity and agency. Okay, and this is something, again, similar to what Butler had said in Gender Trouble, where she very clearly said that there's no escape from discursivity. So any idea of a meta-discursive or, transcendental idea of discursivity is erroneous, according to Butler, that we're all inside discursivity. And we just saw in the previous lecture how hacking lauds Butler in terms of looking at her as moving away from a purely social constructionist position and offering a more complex position of gender. So he seems to appreciate Butler, he seems to support Butler, and he seems to read Butler in that particular way in terms of moving away from a purely social constructionist position in terms of looking at gender and offering a more nuanced understanding of gender, which does incorporate the material interpolated conditions in which the subject is situated. Okay, so and then hacking goes on to say that a logical point is simple. This should be on the screen again. The logical point is simple. Women in flight are the product of social conditions in their homelands. It would be stupid to talk about social construction in that context, because social circumstances so manifestly provoke the fear of staying home and a hope of succor in another land. But since in Canada, woman refugee may seem a straightforward and rather inevitable way of classifying some people, there is indeed a point to claiming that a classification is far from inevitable. One can also argue that this contingent classification and the matrix within which it is embedded changes how some women refugees feel about themselves, their experiences and their actions. Hence, in that indirect way, people themselves are affected by the classification, and if you like, the individual herself is socially constructed as a certain kind of person. So, like I mentioned at the very beginning of this text, the hacking constantly draws on Canadian examples because he's a Canadian, and he talks about specific examples from Canada, topical examples from Canada in terms of corroborating his points. But what he's saying over here is quite interesting. He's saying that the human subject position, the human experientiality can change depending on the change in a particular matrix. So it's better to talk about the matrix as, as an entanglement of material conditions, discursive conditions, economic conditions, financial conditions, in which the subject is embedded, right? And then he goes on to say, one can also argue that this contingent classification and the matrix within which it is embedded changes how some women refugees feel about themselves, their experiences and their actions. So when the matrix changes, the women refugees' experiences of being inside the matrix change as well. Hence, in that indirect way, people themselves are affected by the classification, and if you like, the individual herself is socially constructed as a certain kind of person. So construction away becomes a different kind of a category, right? And hacking, as you mentioned, as we saw, he mentioned a little while ago, that he's is more in favor of looking at the idea of the product, the social product, and the social product becomes more important rather than the social construction. Okay, so and we saw in the previous lecture the idea of the self and how the self too becomes a very important category in hacking's analysis, and how the self can be, again, a situatedness inside a particular matrix, etc. Now we come to the next, category that hacking takes up, and that is emotions. Right? So he talks about emotions. So to what extent are emotions socially constructed? To what extent are emotions purely existential, purely psychological, purely cognitive? So again, he's looking at the entanglement between cognitive and the material dimensions of emotion. And he's pointing out, he's drawing your attention to the dangers of an excessive reliance on social constructionist theory when it comes to understanding and examining emotions. Okay. So this is emotions, the category that hacking takes up next, and this should be on your screen. So emotions provide yet another field of disagreement. So as you can imagine, emotions will be the fiercely contested category in this particular discourse, where when people might make an argument about emotions being socially constructed or emotions being purely interior or internalized. That disagreement, that debate is something that hacking examines in this particular section. So emotions provide yet another field of disagreement. Some students of the subject think that there are basic pan-cultural emotions expressed on human faces, recognized by human beings of every culture, and produced in brain centers, all of them determined by evolutionary history. So this particular thesis of emotion is purely an evolutionary thesis, purely a cognitive thesis, purely a neuroscientific thesis, where people say, there are pan-cultural emotions. They don't depend, they're not contingent on the culture, they're not contingent on the cultural context or the cultural conditions. They are purely internal, and it just, it's a question of evolution, neural evolution, evolution through, different states of neural sophistication, different states of neural development, and in that kind of neuroscientific analysis, emotions exist. So any idea of the cultural specificity of emotions, the cultural conditioning of emotions, is negated by this particular thesis. That's thesis one, according to hacking. He's proposing different theses that are used to study emotions. Others argue that emotions and expression are quite specific to a social and linguistic group. So the converse argument, of course, is that emotions are fiercely dependent, fiercely context-specific, context-sensitive, culture-sensitive, language-sensitive, etc. So how you emote depends on your location in a language, and how you emote depends on your location and culture, location in a particular culture setting, etc. So that's the other thesis of emotion. Paul Ekman, one of the most dedicated universalists, has provided a personal account of the controversy before the social construction era. His opponents then were those mighty figures of a yet earlier generation, Margaret Mead and Geoffrey Bateson. Nowadays, the issues have been translated into social construction talk. When people say that their emotions are socially constructed, or the emotion of grief, say, is a social construct, they do not mean that the idea of the emotions or the grief is constructed, but that the emotions themselves, grief itself, are social constructs. But the word construct has lost all force here. In fact, the emotion entry in my alphabetical list refers to Ron Hatz, The Social Construction of the Emotions. So he's alluding to a particular book by Ron Hatz, and that's The Social Construction of the Emotions. He told me, and this is an anecdotal evidence that hacking is offering us, he told me that the original title was to be The Social Production of Emotions, but the publishers insisted on construction. So again, this is a very crucial point where we're saying how hacking would favor the word production over construction, because he thinks that's a more holistic word, that's a word which is more true to the materiality of the cultural conditions. However, he says that the publishers of that particular book, written by Rom Ham, they insisted to put their foot down in terms of going with the word construction, because that apparently, that presumably, that would sell more, that would attract more readership. So the publishers insisted on construction, believing that that would sell more copies of the book. His later anthology, Harrow and Parrot, 1996, includes many essays by diverse hands about social construction. The authors argue that emotions vary from culture to culture, and the character of grief has changed in Western culture and is changing today, and that the physiological expression of emotion vary from group to group. They argue in various ways that how we describe emotions affects how the emotions are experienced. So again, the question of representation becomes important. So how do you represent emotions, how we describe emotions? That, in a way, determines how the emotions experience. So it's like a loop between representation and experience. Okay? The exact expression of such a thesis depends, of course, on what the author thinks emotions are. Griffiths notes that there are two very different models of the social construction of emotion in the literature. There is a social concept model, according to which emotions are inherently cognitive and conceptual, and are the concepts peculiar to the concepts peculiar to a social group formed by a culture of that particular group. Then there are a social role model, in which emotions is a transitory social role, a socially constituted syndrome. In these discussions, the label social construction is more code than description. There is no literal sense in which either the Victorian concept or the Victorian role of grief was constructed during her most Britannic Majesty's long reign. Social construct is code not for universal, not part of pan-cultural human nature, and don't tread on me with this heavy hegemonic boots of yours. Griffith sensibly contends that the insights of social constructionism are perfectly compatible with what is known about the evolutionary basis of emotions. Since we're not talking about anything what is literally constructed, it is obvious that these insights are best couched in terms of construction talk at all. It is not obvious that these insights are best couched in terms of construction talk at all, but there is a residual force of starting point. Constructionists about the emotions do start by feeling that in the present state of affairs, the emotions are taken for granted, the emotions and expressions of them appear to be inevitable. So, in its entire section, what hacking is saying, again, is that we don't require the word emotions, and we don't require the word construction over here at all, because what we're talking about is a coded qualitative emotions, and you don't require the word construction there. It's culture specific. It's something that comes with a certain kind of cultural setting, but again, that's part of the material apparatus, that's part of the matrix in which the subject is situated. So it's looking at a more nuanced understanding of emotions in terms of combining the universal cognitive model, where we think emotions are something cerebral, something neural. At the same time, it is part of the conditioning, it's part of the materiality of the subject's experience. So to look at emotions from a purely constructionist perspective, according to hacking away, is an error of judgment, is an error of analysis, an epistemic error. So there's no literal sense in which emotions can be constructed according to hacking. So the word construction over here becomes just a very dishy word, a very attractive word, which is used to attract readership, which is used to attract people who are invested in this kind of a study. However, in a literal sense, it means very little. So hacking says we don't require the word construction at all. Code is fine. conditioning is fine. So we're looking at a more balanced way of looking at emotions as being an entanglement between the internal neural psychological phenomenon and external cultural phenomenon. So that's the balance that hacking is trying to arrive at. Okay, so as we can see that throughout this book, throughout this introduction that we are studying quite extensively, hacking is more interested in looking at the materiality of the subject's situatedness. He's moving away from a very narrow constructionist perspective on looking at culture and cultural categories, and rather he's sort of he's calling forth a more balanced understanding of culture and cultural categories and subcategories in which the human subjects are situated. So he's more interested in terms of looking at interaction, in terms of looking at nodal points, in terms of looking at navigation and negotiation with the materiality, with the matrix in which the human subject is situated. Okay, so next we come to a section which is entitled, it's a subsection in this introduction, which is entitled Objects, Ideas and Elevator Words, and where hacking says, 3 distinguishable types of things are said to be socially constructed. The resulting divisions are so general and so fuzzy at the edges that felicitious names do not come to hand. In addition to objects and ideas, we need to take note of a group of words that arise by what Quine calls semantic assent: truth, facts, reality. Since there is no common way of grouping these words, I call them elevator words, for in philosophical discussions they raise the level of discourse. It's giving a random list of words in which are characterized by Quine's idea of semantic assent. So truth, fact, reality. So that's the assent, that's a semantic, the meaningful assent which characterize these words. And so hacking is looking at these words, and again, it's looking at the fallacy of investigating these words from a purely socially constructionist perspective, right? So, and it's looking again at a more nuanced understanding of these categories. So objects, items in the following disparate list are in the world in a commonsensical, not fancy meaning of the phrase. So again, when hacking says in the world, when hacking says situated, it's not being a constructionist, it's not being a loose constructionist philosopher. He's actually calling attention to the situatedness, which is very material in condition, the very real in condition. So it takes into account the lived reality of that situatedness, the experientiality of the situatedness, etc. So what are the disparate lists? People, children; states, childhood; conditions, health, childhood autism; practices, child abuse; hiking; actions, throwing a ball; rape; behavior, generous, fidgety; and classes, middle. So it's giving a list of words and how these words are connotations, and then there are other words like experiences, falling in love, being disabled; relations, gender; material objects, rocks, substances; unobservables, fundamental particles, quarks. Okay, and now he gives some very banal list of conditions, social conditions, and he's saying how these conditions are determined by an objectivity, a reality which is a lived reality, a reality which is rationalized, which is arrived at through a certain constructed reason, which is part of the lived life. It's not really a loose social construct in a sense that constructionists use it. So homes, landlords, house cleaning, rent, dry rot, evictions, bailiffs, squatting, greed, and the Caspian Sea. So it sounds a bit absurd, these words, but then the absurdity is deliberately sort of invoked in this category, in this list of words that hacking is offering us. The id is an object, if there is an id, and who doubts that there are egos, big ones in the world? So, this is a Freudian id that hacking is mentioning. These items are very different categories, are all in the world, so I call them objects for lack of a better label. Adapting a terminology of John Soules, we find that some of these items are ontologically subjective, but epistemologically objective items. And this is a very crucial section in this book, and which will help us understand what hacking means by objectivity and subjectivity. So ontologically subjective, so their existence is subjective, so it depends on the people, it depends on the interactions across people, between people, across different nodal points that people inhabit, but they're epistemologically objective. So a knowledge that comes out of that particular interaction, that knowledge becomes objective in quality. And then he gives a very banal example of house rent. So when you pay house rent, how is house rent, for instance, ontologically subjective and epistemologically objective? So the rent you have to pay is all too objective and in the world, as I put it, but requires human practices in order to exist. So there has to be an interaction between human beings, an agreement between human beings, which is a subjective agreement, in order for the rent to exist, right? So in that sense, it is ontologically subjective. So it will only come to existence, the ontological bit, through a subjective interaction, through a subjective agreement, and therein lies the ontological subjectivity. However, so there'll be no rent if there's no ontological subjectivity. But rent is epistemologically objective. So the knowledge about the rent is objective. You know exactly how much you have to pay, you know exactly when you have to pay, etc. So therein lies the epistemological objectivity of the rent. You know full well there is nothing subjective about it, that a certain amount of money is due on the first of the month. So, and then he goes on to say ideas. I mean, ideas, conceptions, concepts, beliefs, attitudes, to theories. They need not be private. The ideas of this or that person. Ideas are discussed, accepted, shared, stated, worked out, clarified, contested. They may be woolly, suggestive, profound, stupid, useful, clear, or distinct. For present purposes, groupings, classifications, ways of classifying, and kinds of woman refugee will be filed as ideas. Their extensions, classes, sets, and groups, the groups of women refugees now meeting with the Minister of Immigration are collections in the world and so count as objects. I'm well aware that there is much slippage in this core system of sorting. Right. So what Hacking is looking at is the objectification of objects. So he's looking at certain object value of certain objects, and he's saying if you take away the idea of objectivity from these objects, from this matter, and you're looking at it purely as a social constructionist discourse, and obviously you are moving your attention away from the objectivity, the reality, the lived reality of these categories. Okay, so then he moves on. The next section that we'll study is again one of these sections where he talks about the inside and the outside as being situated inside a particular matrix. And a matrix, the word matrix becomes very important for Hacking. So interactions is the next section that we'll study. And interactions become a very important activity in Hacking's analysis, because it's only through interactions that we arrive at decisions, that we make decisions, that we move on, etc. But interactions, again, may not be seen, or should not be seen from a purely social constructionist perspective. So interactions become the next topic for our study. So we'll just begin with this at this point. We have seen how some objects and ideas may interact. The idea of the child viewer of television interacts with the child viewer. Ways of classifying human beings interact with the human beings who are classified. There are all sorts of reasons for this. People think of themselves as of a kind, perhaps, or reject the classification. All our acts are under descriptions, and acts are open for us to depend in a purely formal way on the descriptions available to us. Moreover, classifications do not exist only in the empty space of language, but in institutions, practices, material interactions with things and other people. So again, he's talking about interactions as a very material activity, as a very real activity, and not a purely social constructionist activity. So this is a lived experience, lived reality, etc., and how interactions produce agreements, produce classifications, and this becomes a very key category in Hacking's analysis. So we just started with this, and we stop at this point in this lecture and move on with this in the next lecture, and hopefully conclude the text in another lecture. Thank you for your attention.